Our fast-moving, constantly disrupted world can make even the most experienced executive feel behind the curve. How can you stay up to speed and prepare for the future, despite the many demands of work and life? MIT Sloan Executive Education invites you to join your global peers at the intersection of management, innovation, and technology for short courses that have a big impact. Get ahead of disruption.
Hello, and welcome to today's webinar, Bringing Your Own AI, Balance Rewards and Risks. I'm Lorianne McLaughlin, Senior Editor Digital at MIT Sloan Management Review, and I'll be moderating the event. Today's program is sponsored by MIT Sloan Executive Education. Bring Your Own AI is a topic that no leader can ignore. As generative AI tools proliferate, people continue to experiment with them at work. Leaders need guidelines to mitigate risks and help the organization reap the benefits. Our speakers today are Barbara Wixom and Nick van der Meulen. Barbara Wixom is a principal research scientist at the MIT Center for Information Systems Research, CISR. Nick van der Meulen is a research scientist at CISR. They are the authors of the popular MIT SMR article, Bring Your Own AI, How to Balance Risks and Innovation. Welcome, Barb and Nick.
Thank you, Laurie, for having us. Hi, everyone. So excited to join you today, talk about, as Laurie said, something that's already reshaping work in organizations, whether we realize it or not, and that is Bring Your Own AI. It's what happens when employees use publicly available GenAI tools for work-related tasks. And make no mistake, I'm not talking theory here. This has been happening for quite some time now. It's been on leaders' minds, but just this last week, it gained renewed urgency with the introduction of new DeepSeek models. And the DeepSeek app quickly climbed to the top of app stores worldwide because it seems to deliver advanced frontier-level capabilities for free. And that's just the latest example of this bigger shift of GenAI tools that are becoming more powerful, more accessible, and more widely used. So here's the question. What happens when your employees bring such tools into your organization without oversight? When sensitive data gets entered into platforms that you don't control, when business decisions are made based on outputs that no one quite understands. So this is an urgent challenge because while these tools can help stimulate creativity, productivity, they can also introduce risks that organizations aren't yet equipped to manage. So today, let's explore how leading organizations are thinking about this tension and what you can do to navigate it.
Hey, Nick, let me start with some research context. So, hello, this is my 31st year researching how organizations create value from their data. And for the past decade, AI has been a heavy theme in that regard. I work very closely with the chief data officers, chief analytics officers from the companies you see here on the screen to make sure that research stays on track. Now, when GenAI literally exploded on the scene in 2022, 2023, I invited Nick to join the research because of his employee level expertise. So Nick spent his career studying employee experience in digital transformation contexts. So together we tackled GenAI. So now we're really excited to share some of the practical insights that emerged from our collaboration. So Nick, why don't you kick things off?
Yeah, Barb, like this is really giving us a front row seat, that data board, to how large established organizations are navigating this rise of GenAI. And we're incredibly grateful for that. Because yes, AI seems to evolve at breakneck speed, but the executives from the data board play a huge role in shaping how this plays out in their organization. So what we'll share with you today is what we've learned from those people on the front lines. All right. To really understand GenAI, let's first take a quick step back because AI's impact on work has been evolving for decades. Yet this latest shift, where every employee suddenly has AI at their fingertips, is a little different. So how did we get there? And why does this moment right now demand our attention? So the discipline of artificial intelligence itself goes back to the mid-1950s. Mathematicians and engineers and psychologists, they wondered, could we create thinking machines? And the answer, as it turns out, was yes, but not in the way they originally imagined. Instead of thinking like humans, AI is more about applied analytics, about using math, statistics to uncover patterns in large data sets. And one of the earliest AI programs was ELIZA, a simple chatbot developed in the 1960s with an elaborate script that enabled it to mimic human-like conversation. And you can see its creator here, MIT professor Joseph Weizenbaum. And while we've come a long way in the past 60 years, at its core, AI is still about mimicking human behavior. The script has just gotten a lot better. So at the broadest level, AI is about these analytics models that have some level of autonomy. And for a long time, AI relied on explicit programming. We had to manually code every if-then rule. And we still do that today. If an online shopping customer abandons their cart, then send a discount email. Useful? Sure. Adaptable? Not really, right? Once you coded those rules, they remain fixed. What if AI could improve on its own? So that's where machine learning came along and changed the game. With machine learning, we let the system automatically find patterns in large amounts of data and continuously build and refine its own decision-making models. Instead of us programming every rule, the system learns by seeing lots of examples and refining its predictions over time, often with the help of instructions and supervision that we provide. And that's why machine learning is so effective for things like fraud detection, because it can spot unusual activity in banking transactions that don't fit patterns. Now, within machine learning, we have deep learning. And this is where the models become even more advanced. Traditional machine learning still required humans to define, which features matter, what patterns to look for. But deep learning changed all that. It uses artificial neural networks, layered structures inspired by the human brain, to find patterns without us predefining them. And that's how deep learning powers things like speech recognition for Siri or Alexa, but also image classification. I remember back in 2019, I read about this amazing MIT study where a deep learning model trained on hundreds of thousands of X-ray images was able to predict the likelihood of someone developing breast cancer in the next 5 years. Now, of course, here's the thing. How would you feel about a machine making such a prediction for you? Would you trust it? The challenge with it is that these deep learning models often function like black boxes. So you see this typical depiction of a neural network here with input layers being known, thousands of X-ray images. But to arrive at its output, the prediction, it goes through many hidden layers. And that means we don't always know how deep learning models arrive at their outcomes. And if we don't know how a model reaches its conclusions, then how do we know when to trust it? So that's why in the case of the breast cancer model, radiologists using the model at Boston's Brigham and Women's Hospital had to study it for years. And this past summer, news came that they had been able to figure out that the model was basing its scores on very subtle differences between left and right breast tissue. So by reverse engineering the model, they were able to start trusting its predictions, but they wouldn't have been able to figure that out without that classification process that is inherent in deep learning. Now, within the category of deep learning, we finally reach generative AI. Deep learning models, they help us classify and predict. Generative AI goes further, it creates. Before, a model could tell you if an image contained a cat, but it couldn't create a brand new cat image from scratch. So GenAI takes the next leap there. It can generate new content, text, images, audio, even video, based on vast data sets, typically pulling from most of what's available online. And generative AI models use what we call foundation models, large pre-trained models like OpenAI's GPT, Google's Gemini, Meta's Llama, and these are capable of adapting to a range of tasks. I could argue that GenAI isn't truly creating, it's just reassembling existing data points. But think of it like cooking. You don't have to invent new ingredients, but you can create entirely new dishes by combining what already exists in new ways. A skilled chef can take flour, eggs, and sugar, ingredients we've all seen before, and create something entirely unique. Whether it's a souffle, a croissant, new fusion dish that no one ever tasted. And GenAI works in the same way. And some of it, what it creates, incredible. Some of it is derivative. And some of it is inedible and downright bad for you. But the possibilities, they seem endless. They seem exciting. So with these new GenAI capabilities becoming increasingly available, we wondered how many employees are already using GenAI in their daily work. So we asked the executives from the data board last year, and while their answers varied, they reported that on average, 16% of their employees were collaborating with AI or GenAI, particularly those in administrative roles. Now, since then, that number has most certainly gone up because when asked about their expectations for 2027, this average number rose to 72%. And that was expected primarily by virtue of vendors rolling out new GenAI features in their offerings, which is exactly what we see happening right now. Which points to an important nuance that became clear to us as we were doing this research. Often, when there's talk of GenAI, it involves a comparison of GenAI in contrast to predictive AI or traditional AI, meaning other applications of AI involving machine learning or deep learning. And while that's useful to understand what GenAI is, it doesn't help us understand how GenAI is showing up in organizations and how to realize value from it. So rather than consider GenAI this amorphous blob that can be anything and everything, we found that there are two different types of GenAI implementations in organizations. The first is what we call generative AI tools: ChatGPT, Gemini, Stable Diffusion, Adobe Acrobat AI, most of Microsoft's copilots. These are all general purpose, designed to enhance individual productivity, no matter your role or functional area in the organization. They're easy to access, in many cases completely free, and they're broadly applicable. You can use them to draft an email, summarize a meeting, create marketing materials, generate code. And as one participant in our research very aptly put it, these are all productivity shaves. It gives you, as an employee, 10 minutes back here, 30 there. But in the end, it's very hard to translate those minutes into tangible top or bottom line value. In order to get there, you have to create generative AI solutions, which focus on strategic objectives and are tailored to specific stakeholders. Meaning that rather than rely on individual employees to apply GenAI in their workflows, you develop a solution that is scalable and fit for purpose. You still use a foundation model like GPT, but you integrate it into your systems, your processes, your offerings. For instance, at Wolters Kluwer, which is a global information business supporting healthcare, tax, legal organizations, GenAI has been a game changer. So for decades, for instance, they provided banks with access to lien information through their iLien platform. And a lien is a legal claim on an asset like a house or a car used as collateral for a loan. So managing that data is crucial for banks when deciding whether to approve loans. And traditionally, analyzing lien documents was a very slow process, especially if lien documents were scanned as images. But Wolters Kluwer, they developed a GenAI solution called Borrower Analytics, which can interpret raw lien text directly from such scans. Now, the impact of this solution is that banks that once took weeks to process loans can now do it in just days. And that is not something that an individual employee at either Wolters Kluwer or the bank could have done on their own with a GenAI tool. It takes effort from many stakeholders to create these solutions, to integrate them into systems and their offerings, and make sure that these result in real measurable value. So one major difference between these two types of GenAI is therefore where the responsibility for success lies. With GenAI tools, that's the employee. And that employee has to instruct the tool just so to get the output they need. But with solutions, the responsibility shifts. The organization, those who develop the solution, has to own the success by designing a solution that integrates into workflows, ensuring that employees don't have to think about whether they're using the AI correctly. And that distinction matters because it affects how we govern AI, for instance, but also, as I alluded to earlier, in how we approach value. With GenAI solutions, you'll want to be able to show top or bottom line improvements. Financially, that's the exciting stuff, and Barb will touch on this later in the webinar. But for GenAI tools, that's not the case. GenAI tools are about managing costs. In a way, they simply represent, for most organizations, the new cost of doing business. And that's because there's no way around them. They can't be ignored because every employee with a smart device has instant free access to GenAI tools. Right now, anyone watching this webinar, you can pull out your phone, open ChatGPT or DeepSeek, ask it to explain quantum mechanics in the style of a Taylor Swift song. It'll do it, and it will cost us nothing out of pocket. And that presents a risk, of course, because as the famous saying goes, when you're not paying for the product, you are the product. And you may recall a major tech company reporting an incident back in 2023 where employees unaware of risks had entered sensitive company data into a GenAI tool, assuming their conversations were private. They weren't. And that confidential data was absorbed into the model's training data and could potentially be surfaced to other users of the tool. And just like that, data that the organization never intended to share was out of their control. And no organization wants to face such a scenario. But let's be realistic. Banning these tools outright won't work. It's neither practical nor effective. And that's because employees, especially those who are already feeling like they're going flat out, trying to keep up with the relentless pace of change, they're turning to the promise of these tools to enhance their personal productivity. And they're hearing one message loud and clear through the popular press, like the jobs of people who don't know how to work with AI will be replaced by people who do. So if we restrict access to these tools, employees won't just stop using GenAI, they'll start looking for workarounds, turning to personal devices, using unsanctioned accounts, hidden tools. So instead of mitigating risk, we'd have made it harder to detect and manage. So let's actually take a moment to talk about these risks. And to do that, I have to quickly explain a bit more about how GenAI works. And to make it concrete, just imagine you're a hiring manager. You're responsible for writing a job description for a new role. And instead of drafting it from scratch, you decide to use a GenAI tool to help you. Well, first, we need to understand where GenAI gets its data. Like I said, GenAI is trained on massive amounts of data from across the internet. Not just job descriptions, but also resumes and interview guides and HR policies, industry blogs, general writing about business, politics, travel, anything and everything under the sun. But having all of this data doesn't automatically make it useful. It has to be distilled into a foundation model, which acts as the AI's brain, if you will. This is where the deep learning has taken place to find patterns in the data, along with the context in which it's used, which it can use to generate new content. Here's the catch. This AI isn't an expert HR assistant by default. It doesn't know magically what you need. It has data about job descriptions, but can also help you write a recipe or a movie script. It's a generalist. It's not a specialist. So think of it as having a good but untaught assistant. They've read everything about hiring, but don't know your needs until you tell them. So that's why prompting or providing input to the model becomes important. You need it to ask it, for instance, to write a job description for a marketing manager. Now you've given the tool some direction, and that can shape its response in the form of output. The model takes all it's learned about marketing manager job descriptions and generates one for you in seconds. It's not copied from anywhere. It's a unique creation based on the patterns and probabilities it has inferred from the data. And ultimately, you decide how to apply this output, whether to go back, perhaps adjust your prompt, to use it as a first draft, or use it straight away without making any changes. At every stage of this system, there are risks. For instance, and here's something obvious, but definitely worth saying, not everything on the internet is accurate. I know it's shocking, but this is where GenAI gets its training data, meaning that if the internet has biases, and spoiler alert, it does, the foundation model will happily absorb them. It's like a sponge, but instead of soaking up water, it's soaking up every questionable hiring practice from the past 30 to 40 years, and it's ready to reproduce it in its outputs, thereby amplifying biases. What's more is that foundation models are commonly known to hallucinate. Now, I'm not a fan of the term because it makes it sound like, this GenAI tool had a bad night in Vegas or something. But that's what we've commonly started to use to describe what happens when a model generates output that sounds plausible, but is completely false. That's because these models, again, are probability-based algorithms. They predict a likely string of words. So if you were to ask it to include required qualifications for a marketing manager in Massachusetts, it can give you a very confident but totally incorrect list that doesn't match at all with Massachusetts labor law. And sometimes the risk lies with us. The quality of our instructions directly affects the quality of the output. If a prompt is unclear, vague, missing context, then the GenAI tool will generate something completely irrelevant. So rather than say, hey, write a job description for a marketing manager, you might want to add that it's for a mid-sized construction company and that the candidate should have experience in digital advertising and lead generation. Good input leads to better output. Even then, because of how foundation models work, like I said, the output might be flawed. And copy pasting that output is just a recipe for disaster. Just imagine what happens if the job description looks very polished, very professional, but somehow violates fair hiring laws. Would you notice it? Would your hiring team catch it? That's why we can't rely on output as is. It needs to be verified. Because if we all start applying GenAI tools in this manner and are careless, we risk perpetuating social inequalities. So takeaway is that GenAI tools are not neutral. It reflects the data it was trained on, the choices of its model developers, and our own biases. So to mitigate these risks, we need to do three things. The first is inform everyone about two things: guardrails, which are enabling constraints, and guidelines, which are additional norms and best practices that employees should take into account. And to do that, we want to draw not just on your data and technology experts, but because the risks are so varied, we also want to draw on those in legal, in privacy, in compliance, in ethics, to make sure that, yes, at the bare minimum, people need to know that there are clear rules in place as to under which conditions they can and cannot use GenAI tools. One member of the data board told us in their organization, they communicated to everyone, these uses are always okay. Searching the web, using publicly available information, fine. Versus never okay. Anything involving personally identifiable information, strategic information, proprietary data, that's off limits. And they had a clear process in place for anyone who was considering a use that might be okay. In that case, they could reach out to the AI governance team for help or clarification. So when we did a survey among senior data and technology leaders last year, only 30% of them reported that their policies regarding employee AI model use were either somewhat or very well developed. Now, anecdotally, we're already seeing great improvements here. But in addition to straightforward policies, we also need to provide guidelines, best practices when it comes to the use of these tools. And one of our member organizations, OCP Group, has been really good about their tool guidance, for instance, because their guidelines touch on things like fundamental ethical concerns with GenAI, like that lack of transparency I talked about earlier, or concerns around intellectual property rights violations when it comes to some of that training data. And that's important because as leaders in organizations, we're all not just implementing tools, we're shaping the ethical and cultural landscape for how our employees use this technology responsibly. And employees need to know that every time they use an online GenAI tool to help them draft an email, that they're essentially pouring out a bottle of clean drinking water that's instead being used to cool a very energy-hungry data center that's keeping coal-based power plants open for longer. So when it comes to making informed decisions about tool use, we want people to make informed decisions that are in line, with organizational policies and norms, but also their personal norms. And to learn about some of this, we need training and education. Even more so because employees also need to know how to make effective use of these tools. We need them to have what we call AI direction and evaluation skills, or AID skills. As I mentioned earlier, the onus of success when it comes to GenAI tool use is on the employee. If you don't understand the basics of how a large language model functions, what its capabilities, its limitations are, and if you don't know how to instruct that model just so in order to get the output you need, then that limits the effectiveness of the tool. So we know that effective prompting is important. We need to craft those instructions carefully with precise problem statements and context and detailed process descriptions. And that's something that you can't just learn by watching an online tutorial. You have to learn this by doing, by working alongside others who are really good at this. So at Zoetis, which is a global animal health company, the data and analytics unit now organizes thrice weekly office hours. And every call they do has at least 100 employees on it, learning the ropes, asking questions on how to get started or to get better at this. And in the words of their chief data and analytics officer, JD Williams, they want to have their people learn how to change a tire by changing a tire. So on these calls, they have people have their browser open and try things. That's how you get these skills. Over 3,000 people in just a couple of months, with over 70% saying, hey, this has helped me achieve what I wanted to do with GenAI. And that's incredible. Which brings me to the third success factor with GenAI tools, and that's providing a few sanctioned tools from trusted vendors. Because just like banning these tools won't work, not providing any tools also won't work, because then it becomes impossible to safely use these tools more broadly in one's role. Now, of course, the challenge is figuring out which kinds of tools to support, because they don't come for free. And maybe initially they are more or less free, but once these free trials and incentives end, the pricing of those tools typically runs, at least in the tens of dollars per seat per month per tool. That adds up over time. So to figure out what is worth the money, you need to ask your employees, users of these tools. And what I found really intriguing with Zoetis is that they've set up what they call a GenAI app store. And there, employees can apply for tool licenses. So it's not just everyone, here's your seat. No, if you want to use a tool, then apply for a license and let them know, what do you intend to do with it? Give them feedback on whether that worked. And those are so-called user stories. And that is what Zoetis is collecting. And I think it's key. It's how you avoid paying $50 a month for Joe from finance who used a specific GenAI tool exactly once to write a birthday card. Moreover, when employees explain how they plan to use it, and this is key, they share their success stories. And that way, it's not just, hey, here's a cool tool. It's, here's how this tool actually helped me do my job better. And at Zoetis, the GenAI App Store ties all of the success factors together. Others can learn from the user stories, but Zoetis also provides getting started guides in the App Store, training videos, recordings from previous office hours, reports with industry insights. They outline their policies and guidelines around all of this. Everything in one place, all together, to make it easy to find and process. Yeah, some of that reduces those risks I mentioned earlier, but it also serves as a catalyst for innovation. Just imagine being able to scale some really effective individual user stories across your entire workforce in the form of GenAI solutions. That's powerful. And Barb, I know you have some thoughts about this and what it takes to do just that.
I do. And I think after presenting the framework that our executives are finding really helpful, I think it's important to remind everyone what the end game is here. The point of AI, regardless of its flavor, should be to create value for our organizations, and ideally value that hits our books. And what we found in the research is that separating AI tools from solutions That helps us tackle each differently and manage their value properly. So again, tools, as Nick, you said earlier, that's a cost management play. Tools help personal productivity. We need to manage them similarly to how we manage spreadsheets and word processing. Solutions, they result in ROI for a specific use case. So solutions help areas of the company, whether it be call center, marketing, software development, and they offer measurable lift in either efficiencies or sales. But what's nice that we saw in the research is that there's important relationship between tools and solutions. When you establish healthy use of tools, that actually helps with overall AI upskilling across the organization. This is key. As employees work with tools, they're learning really important data science skills, concepts like probabilism, like AI explanation. And so you're elevating data science in the organization. At the same time, you're helping with innovation, like you just were talking about, Nick, where employees, as they work with tools, they become better at innovation, understanding what can be. And this helps in ideating solutions, it helps with development, and it also helps with adoption. I want to share, so if you could show a quote. Nick talked about Wolters Kluwer before. Here's another quote from this recent case that we did, and I'll just read it. So one of the leaders, he said, it used to take weeks or even months to experiment because of ongoing back and forth and lengthy development process. And he's talking about specifically AI development. In the past, people would come to us with just ideas and rough requirements. Now with GenAI, domain and data experts work together rapidly to build prototypes. They come to us saying, I've already built this. Now I want to test and scale it. That's a big difference. In the traditional AI research, starting at around 2019, we were seeing 1 to 2 year cycles with development in machine learning projects. In GenAI, we are seeing 1 to 2 month cycles. That's an incredibly exciting opportunity for organizations, but only if we get GenAI right.
Yeah, absolutely. And that involves also getting those GenAI tools right so we can start to experiment with that. I figure let's start putting some numbers behind all of what we just talked about. Maybe do a poll vote as to how this is playing out in organizations. So this one is multiple choice. You can tick as many boxes as you'd like. So have you developed guardrails and guidelines to direct GenAI tool use? Do you invest in training to develop those AI direction and evaluation skills? Do you provide enterprise sanctioned GenAI tools from trusted vendors, at least some of your employees? And does your organization, or perhaps your organization, bans GenAI tools? Perhaps it lacks an approach altogether. So cast your votes now and we'll have a look as they come in.
It'll be interesting to see how much banning there is. And those who have banned, I wonder if they'll even think about that, a second time after this webinar, because I think that was one of the strongest message we heard across our interviews is that banning could only potentially backfire.
Yes, absolutely. So as we see the results come in, I see about a third of organizations thus far say we do not have a plan. So hopefully this gives you some ideas on how to get started. Just under
and what I like about the framework and the article, Nick, is it's some actionable, actual practices that you can take in terms of establishing those guardrails and even setting the right expectations for value creation. Knowing, are you going after personal productivity versus are you going after an actual type of monetary lift for the organization? That's a big difference. And even just establishing that and having the right conversations, I think, can be helpful for managers.
Absolutely. And I think, if we look, just under a quarter saying we have a GenAI policy, fifth saying we invest in training. It'd be interesting to see kind of like the combinations of what people are doing. And we definitely from what we've seen in our research, organizations are starting to get some traction with this, luckily. And it's really key. Luckily, only 4% saying like we have banned generative AI. So that is positive. Because like we said, it doesn't do much for your
And
organization.
for
It can only
those who
backfire.
don't have a plan, who need the policy, need the training, much more is being rolled out as a part of vendor solutions. For instance, there's a lot more available online in terms of best practices. We'll certainly be showcasing policies and training ideas in our research and our cases and such. So hopefully there are more tools today for those who are putting their plans together.
Absolutely. And our research on this is ongoing too. So stay tuned for that. All right, given the time, let's close the poll here and let me just quickly wrap up in a couple of minutes so we have enough time for Q&A. Just kind of like take stock of the entire presentation. We've covered a lot, but if there's one thing we hope you'll take away from this session, it's that bring your own AI isn't a future problem. It's happening right now. It's inevitable, but that doesn't mean we have to fear it, provided we take the right actions. First, like we said, don't ban GenAI tools. It's neither practical nor necessary. Instead, the real challenge and opportunity is figuring out how to harness them effectively. It starts with setting up those guardrails, those guidelines to support safe experimentation. Just think of it as teaching someone to drive. You don't just hand them the keys and hope for the best. GenAI is no different. Employees need to know what's always okay, never okay, what best practices are, and where to ask for help. Second, we should recognize GenAI is not magic. It takes skill, and developing that skill takes practice. So we talked about AI direction and evaluation skills. It comes from hands-on training, engaging in communities of practice, rather than e-learning modules. Third, provide enterprise-vetted GenAI tools from trusted vendors, because employees will use GenAI, whether it's sanctioned or not. And the question is, will they be using the right tools? So be methodical about figuring out what employees' needs are in this space so you can contain costs while encouraging experimentation that might lead to those lucrative generative AI solutions. All right, let me close with this note that GenAI doesn't look like it's going to slow down. And whether we like it or not, it's already woven into how work gets done. So our challenge to you, start the conversation. Ask your teams how they already using GenAI, because you might be surprised by what you hear. 2, lay the groundwork, set up those guardrails, those guidelines, those training opportunities. But most importantly, 3, act now. The future of AI at work isn't something that happens to us. It's something that we can choose to shape. So let's start that today. Thank you.
All right. I'm ready for some questions.
Yes.
Thank you for that great presentation. Okay, so for our first question, Barb and Nick, you talked about the difference between GenAI tools and GenAI solutions. What are the key indicators that an off-the-shelf GenAI tool is no longer sufficient and a custom solution is needed?
So first, lack of adoption for sure. The one thing about a tool that's interesting is that we can actually monitor adoption. So if we've rolled out a tool and we're not seeing traction with that tool, that's a signal that something's going on. So we need to do some root cause analysis there. Also, I think when we go to put a tool in place, and if we've done an assessment high level and see that the risks are outweighing the benefits, then we need to quickly regroup and decide if we want to potentially start with a solution that's more focused and has more organizational control over how that moves forward.
Yeah, and I should add to that even with solutions, you see that there are vendors out there that have created kind of like these custom solutions for industries or specific functions, and they're typically also off the shelf, right? So the same kind of like applies, not just going from tools to solutions, but even within solutions, like when do you move from like off the shelf to what we have in our research identified kind of like 3 approaches: buy, boost, and build. So whether you rely on kind of like these off the shelf whether you start using things like retrieval augmented generation, or whether you actually move into perhaps using open source models and fine tuning them, right? It's increasingly bringing that context and uniqueness of your own organization into the solution. And that partly becomes with like how accurate and precise and related to that context and needs of your organization does it need to be.
Okay, thanks for that. Moving on to the next question, one of our viewers, Chuck, asks, can you give a couple examples or thoughts around curating the cross-functional teams? Everybody wants to be part of that group, which may not be especially helpful, and I'm looking for the right balance.
So I can start, Nick. So we're doing research right now, actually, that's in process on oversight and governance. And what we're finding is that to try to understand what's different about GenAI, you have to start with how you're currently managing. And so going back to the parts of the organization, like who's accountable for risk, who's accountable for legal, who's accountable for security, who's accountable for compliance, all those different areas are already performing different types of oversight tasks. So the best way to start cross-functionally is to go to those sources, pull them in so that they're bringing that expertise of what's already happening with all kinds of other types of challenges in the organization. And then you would want to then add to that group those who have expertise in the data science and the GenAI specifically, so that you can then have that GenAI flavor. But one thing for Chuck to know is, unfortunately, we're not going to suggest a small group. We're going to suggest a large group with a lot of discourse, because there are so many different facets that have to be considered.
Yeah, diversity is definitely your friend. And Chuck, what a good problem to have, right? That you have like almost too many people that want to help you make this a success. But like Barb says, like figuring out the people who are already like in a good position, but making sure that you have the voices from all these people that are saying like, hey, I have thoughts about this. Like find a way to bring them into the conversation, whether it is through town halls or, having virtual sessions or whatever your organization has in place to kind of like amplify that employee voice within your organization. That's going to be really crucial so that people feel that it's not something that is done to them. They are part of making this a success in your organization. That's how you're going to get buy-in.
Okay, so bring your emotional intelligence and your classic change management skills to the table, right? Okay, let's move on to the next question. This is an interesting question from Andrea, and I suspect others may relate to. What if employees in the organization are much more sophisticated in their GenAI knowledge tools as compared to the leadership and the wider organization? What advice do you have for dealing with that dynamic?
Yeah, I can dive in. And we see this first, great opportunity for reverse mentoring. So a practice that can be really effective in organizations as you're talking about contemporary emerging technology topics, where junior folks or people maybe frontline even have more expertise, and that's the case you're describing. So that's the one thing that I would take it as a leader, of really uplifting those who do have that expertise and doing some reverse mentoring for sure. The other is there's a structure, we call it a networked structure in the organization, a community of practice, that is a really effective mechanism when you have that kind of expertise to pull that together into something that the enterprise can benefit. So you don't just have individual expertise, you can accumulate that within a community of practice, for instance, and then funnel and channel that expertise such that management leadership can start really tapping into it and coordinating with it.
Yeah, at the same time, I should point out, it's like if junior people, have more knowledge about this, Barb said the reverse mentoring is like really great because it's not an excuse to, as leaders say, it's like, well, this is something that, people more junior in the organization are doing. Like you still need to become knowledgeable about this technology, this development that is affecting your organization, right? Because as leaders, you have the institutional knowledge to, once you kind of like grasp what the technology means, you are in a better position to see what it means for your, for your products or for your organizational business model, for what it means in terms of competition. Like all of this is why, as leaders, you need to become knowledgeable about this. So 100% reverse
Oh,
mentoring is really
and
important.
also I should say, and this is what reverse mentoring helps with, but leaders should be investing in their own training for
Yes.
sure. So hopefully this webinar is a part of that, right? Leaders, absolutely. We've found in the research that the ability for executives to have data AI savvy is absolutely something that impacts the success of initiatives like GenAI in organizations. It's really important. So reverse mentoring, but then just take some old-fashioned classes and keep attending these types of webinars. That would be helpful.
And when you have these communities of practice, it's important to be in the tools where people are talking about their experiments as well. So if they're in, Slack or Teams, wherever you're chatting, the leaders want to be listening to those conversations inside of those tools as well. All right. So this brings up an interesting question, which is with the experiments, one of the principles that you advocate for in the article is to evangelize the successful experiments en route to building a case for a larger organizational solution. What advice would you have for people as far as how can I best showcase my successful experiments?
So I love the Zoitis example that they have, right? With the user stories where, you get people to share like what is working for you, and kind of like through people seeing that and they're like, oh, let me try this out, see if it works, right? And like if you all of a sudden start seeing multiple people in a specific role or part of the organization adopting a specific practice and using and tweaking a specific prompt, like, wait, is that something that we can do? Or you hear someone who says like, hey, actually, this process with the help of Gen AI, I can achieve X number of productivity gains. Just imagine if it was tied into systems, right? If it was tied into some of the workflows that we have going on at scale. Seeing it through that way is definitely one of the important things. Again, as you mentioned, Laurie, like keeping your ear to the ground, seeing like, okay, what is happening? What are people talking about is one major thing. Barb, have you seen other?
First, in all of my decades of research, when it comes to creating value, having tangible examples that you can share is always a part of being successful. So the key is where in the organization to inventory that, if you will. Some organizations have a data science center of excellence that leads an intranet or repositories of stories, or can embed stories into training, or in other cases, maybe an organization can rely on a community of practice, again, some kind of network platform where they can accumulate these stories. But at the end of the day, especially because Gen AI is so new, until a user really sees what can happen, and not just, some of Nick's crazy examples of, using, doing Taylor Swift, inspired types of quantum explanations, but to actually get those great examples from within the context of your own organization. Until they see what can be, it's hard to ideate on your own. And so that becomes really important. The other thing is having examples, and then also not just this is what we did, but also here's how we measured, here's the actual impact that resulted, here are the benefits versus what we saw on our income statement as an impact. Those types of granular nuances to help educate around a use case. That's really helpful too in moving the organization forward in their success.
And highlighting it too, right? If you have enterprise communications, if you have a newsletter that goes out, or an internet where regular posts are being, that it's celebrated there. And
Right.
this is not
Town
something,
halls.
yeah, exactly. This is not something that people should be ashamed of. Like, oh yeah, I need to use ChatGPT to become more productive. Like, no, this is something that is, improving your work. And, really good examples. We love to celebrate them. So tell us, and maybe you'll be featured in the next, communication, right? That's the kind of sentiment that you want to create.
So choose your metrics carefully and repeat your successes often. All right, we have time for a few more questions. One of the viewers, Tanya, says, I loved the suggestion of having a team within the organization to support employees in developing their AI skills. What are the key skills or attributes required for people on that team?
All right. So skills for if you are helping other people, become
Exactly.
more adept, right? It's like you need to know a little bit about, if you're trying to teach AI direction and evaluation skills, right? You need to already know about good practices when it comes to prompting, for instance, right? You want to explain to people like, hey, this is why it's important to provide context. You need to know a little bit about how does a Gen AI foundational model work. You want all of that, but also the importance of critically evaluating that output and being able to sit down with people and saying like, hey, this is what's coming out. Like, does anything look off to you? Or like, how do we know that this is correct? Right? Those are some of the things, like critical thinking skills, like very hard to measure, but know that people that are, a little bit more curious and questioning by nature will probably be very well suited, that have a technical inclination as well, that know that, the non-deterministic nature of these models is affecting the results. Those are all
I
skills.
also
Yeah.
think, Nick, is something around vendor knowledge is important too. One of the things that's been really interesting and different about Gen AI is the importance of really understanding what's going on the vendor side of things. So, we talk a lot about AI explanation and acceptable AI and acceptable data use, but how are all those manifesting in the vendors that are providing the solutions? What kinds of contracts are in place between the organization and the vendor in terms of access to data and what are the vendors being asked to provide? I think it would be really important for that expertise, that knowledge, to be in the people who are then helping the employees to really make sure that that is transparent, because vendors are such a big part of certainly the tools and in many cases the solutions as well. And I just bring that up because that's unusual. We haven't had to care so much about that in the past, but with this case, that whole vendor partnering management is actually a pretty important part.
That's a good point, because the costs are such an important part of the ROI on these tools. That's important expertise to have on that team. Thanks for bringing that up. Okay, we have time for one more question. This is a good one. For organizations who are just at the beginning of their journey with Gen AI, and they are bearing down on this topic we are discussing today in terms of balancing risks, what is the most impactful first step they can take in the, let's say, the first 90 days to get going here?
Why don't I take one, Nick, and you can, yeah. I would say establish a center of excellence. And when I say that, it could be a person. It doesn't have to be an elaborate, depending on the organization. But I say that because by establishing a center of excellence, then you are planting the seed for an enterprise perspective, for enterprise responsibility. And it also then establishes a role or a structure that then has permission to go across the organization to start bringing those together. Because as you heard, we're going to have to be bringing those together, to create use cases, bringing those together for guardrails, bringing those. So having, again, that center of excellence established is a great first step to start the journey in a really solid way. So Nick, I don't know if you agree with that or have a different
No,
one.
I 100% agree with that. And I would just add to that, because once you have that, once you have people that are starting, these people can start the conversation. Like we said, it's like you want to hear from your employees. In what ways are you using generative AI right now? What kind of tools are you turning to? Because you'll want to move away from them using these publicly available tools, right? You want to figure out, okay, which ones are we going to offer? Um, and knowing how to do that is knowing where your people are and why they are turning to specific tools right now. So the sooner you have a good grasp of that, the sooner you can start moving to these trusted enterprise grade tools.
Important to listen about what they're already using as you start this journey. Excellent point. Okay, well, Barb and Nick, thank you so much for sharing your insights today. Thank you, audience, for asking such great questions of our speakers. And thank you to our sponsor, MIT Sloan Executive Education.